This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Today is November the 10th, 2025. Welcome to the podcast and welcome to Fall Almost Winter. Today, I want to talk about the U.S. federal government policy on the U.S. court system. This is important for several reasons. And the main reason is when you are watching the news, we the people have to understand why the executive branch acts a certain way, the judicial branch works a certain way, and then the legislative branch works a certain way. So let's dig into some details first to lay the foundation of what I want to talk about later. So as you know, the court system is based on a system of checks and balances where the Constitution establishes the judicial branch, courts create lower federal courts and sets their jurisdiction, and the executive branch enforces the court's decisions. Now that's very important because you might be under the impression that the court systems just exclusively stops an executive from doing something. So when the executive branch, and in this case President Donald Trump, is talking about enforcing the law, the Constitution gives the president that responsibility, right? Now, going back to Congress for just a second, Congress determines the number of judges, handles the confirmation of judicial nominees, and controls the budget for the courts. Okay, so everybody kind of knows that. But Congress, so that's why the Senate votes on the judges that a president can nominate. Now, quickly talking about the judicial branch, their mission is to provide fair and impartial justice, interpret laws, uphold the constitutional rights, while judges must adhere to ethical guidelines, etc., etc., etc. Now, as you know, there has been a clash between the executive branch and the judicial branch. Why not the legislative branch? Because the Republicans currently control that branch of government. And remember, each branch is equal to the other. But again, just say it again, the executive branch enforces court decisions and the Constitution. Now, the judicial branch, to kind of dig in for a second, since the conflict is between the executive and judicial branch, interprets laws and the Constitution, resolves legal disputes, preserves constitutional rights, and ensures fair justice. Okay, so that's the clash. Now, executive branch enforces the decisions of federal courts. How does a president do this? So according to Article 2 of the Constitution, vests executive power in the president, who is responsible for ensuring laws are faithfully executed. So I've said that about 3 or 4 times. Okay, so contrary to what you hear all the time, the president ensures the laws of the United States, to include the Constitution, are followed. How can a president do that? Trump administration, executive orders. The president can issue executive orders, which are official directives that manage operations of the federal government and have the force of law by only if they are based on powers granted by the Constitution or the Congress. Now, that's a formal statement. So, if you look at the National Guard going into cities, somewhere in the Constitution it talks about the power of a president being able to do that. And the president has, and this is all presidents, huge legal team of attorneys who enforce the laws of the land. So that's where everything generates from. So a president doesn't randomly say, well, I want to send troops to Washington State and I think I can do that. Everything has to originate with the perception that that president is protecting the people in that state and that they have constitutional authority. Now that's where the issues come in between with the judicial. How does it start? So if it's Washington State, for example, their state attorney general will say, no, that's not true. You didn't interpret this law correctly of your power, and we're saying that you can't do that. And since January 20th, when the President Trump was sworn in, that's how it's been. There's been this constant fight, which I think is healthy at times, to interpret the Constitution. And the president has the right to do that. I don't consider that abuse of executive power if the intent is to enforce the laws. Now, some would disagree with that, and this is still facts and data, but the Constitution gives the executive, President Trump in this case, the right to do that. Executive actions. Other tools like presidential memoranda, proclamation, signing statements can also be used to shape policy and direct the executive branch and control over subordinates. Everyone that works for the president, we're talking about the president's staff, who are agency chiefs for all of the departments like energy, agriculture, attorney general. They have to follow the president's directive. Now, in this case, and the reason that I'm bringing this up is because in the President Trump's first administration, his cabinet rebelled against him when he was interpreting and enforcing the law in his view. And that's why when he was campaigning at first, this old cabinet went against him, and they all did up a letter to the Washington Post and all that stuff. The importance of knowing this is that whoever is working for the president, the power is vested in that president to put out the policy, and the people working for him in the cabinet are compelled to do it. What they were doing was pushing back and saying, nope, I don't think that that's right. That's not their job. And during this second administration, I understand now why someone like President Trump picks people who will follow what he's telling them. That's important. And in any other business endeavor or corporation or company, you have to have people who will follow what you're saying. And that's not unusual. And it was bad on the first Trump administration cabinet appointees to rebel against a president like that. So, now, currently, the executive and judicial branches are at odds due to their fundamental roles in interpreting the Constitution and checking each other's power. Disagreements arise from an executive branch asserting broad or unilateral power, while the Supreme Court uses its authority of judicial review to limit the power. So that's the definition of the actual conflict between the executive and judicial branch. So, president is enforcing the laws through policy statements or actions, and then the Supreme Court, if they hear this, their job is to review it and say, yep, that checks with the Constitution. No, it doesn't check with the Constitution. And that is healthy and that is normal. Every president, I'll say it again, every president has asserted enforcing the law. And this is not unusual. And the mainstream media seems to act like that these types of actions coming from President Trump, in this case, who the executive, is unusual, it's mean, it's scary, and that's just not the case. Now let's look at some of the wins and loses so far. Now keep in mind that the president has only been in office since January the 20th. Now, it is true to say that he wants to enforce the law. That's a fact. That's not my opinion. All right. So according to Forbes, this is and as usual, I had to search for a while to find true information. The Trump administration has lost 60% of the court rulings against it since Inauguration Day. It's won 31%, while another 9% were mixed rulings, both in favor and against the administration. So based on a total of 191 rulings between January 20th and this article says July 8th. So there's a little bit more. Okay, so what did he lose? He lost. Judge John Kugenhauer issued the first major ruling of the Trump second term, imposing an injunction that blocked the president's new restrictions on birthright citizenship from taking effect nationwide. Now, let me tell you why I'm reading through some of these. So, the mainstream media has a bad thing of not reporting things evenly, and then people get even more scared when the president is enforcing or trying to enforce this rule and the court blocks it. So people should be going to the U.S. Supreme Court website and seeing if the courts say that this is a yes or a no. That's why I'm reading through some of them. The birthright thing was a big thing for about a month or two. And this is telling us that, in fact, the Trump administration lost. So anyone saying anything and scaring people, otherwise it's just not true. He also lost the Trump administration to restore health-related government websites that had taken offline following Trump's inauguration after Doctors for America argued that information being removed violated federal law and the loss of information harmed its membership. Now, President did win, cleared the way for the Trump administration to enforce its policy against federal employees to decide if they wanted a buyout offer, as to reverse a previous order he issued that blocked the deadline for employees to respond, ruling the unions were brought. The lawsuit didn't have standing to challenge the policy. Now, they have a list of them, and I would ask folks to go and look there. The soundbite from the mainstream media is very misleading at times. There is oversight of any executive in the administration that the legal review from the Supreme Court is very, very important, and people's rights are being interpreted through the Constitution, and the loom and doom and this is the end of times rhetoric coming from the mainstream media, and also getting people riled up that somehow somebody is abusing power, no matter if it's the legislative branch or the judicial branch, just isn't true. Everyone has their power checked. And when an executive, and in this case, President Donald Trump, is trying to enforce the law, it is normal for the other side to challenge it. And is healthy discussion, not this loom and doom that the mainstream media tries to attach, that somehow the person sitting in the White House is the most evil person known to man. So go out to the Supreme Court website and see how some of these have been litigated through the review of the Supreme Court. This one was a little long, sorry, but there was a lot to cover. This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Let me know what you think.